All right. Hey guys, we're back on the podcast. I'm Dr. Jacob Gooden, and we have Bryce Lewis with us, Kristen Dunsmore, and Mike Tushirer. And today we're going to be talking about preparing for your first powerlifting meet. So I recently just did my first powerlifting meet. It was a fun experience. Garrett convinced me to do it, and I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. So the first thing I want to talk about is how training for powerlifting is different than just going into the gym. So I'm going to field this off to the experts.
Yeah, so while you resistance train in a gym, it's different in that powerlifting is a sport where you're really trying to maximize like specific lifts at a specific time. So a lot of your training is kind of geared toward this concept of how good can we get you at doing these three very specific lifts on a single day. So that includes elements of practice, technique, skill acquisition, and then figuring out what weight you can ultimately put on the bar.
I also find that for me, going to the gym, it's hard to stay motivated over time. And usually what happens, people start going to the gym and then they eventually kind of dissipates. But having a goal in mind, such as the meet, it's no longer just going to the gym to work out because you can, hang out with friends. It's now you have a goal in mind, and so you're training, and so it makes it easier to stay on track.
Yeah, that training specificity is an important part of it. Mike, could you speak to that a little bit? Just training specifically for squat, bench, and deadlift. How does that alter the programming?
You're going to spend more time practicing those lifts and doing things that will move those lifts forward, and less time doing, there's lots of ways to exercise, right? But we're going to ignore most of those in favor of things that are very focused on this one task. I mean, I think it would be interesting to hear from you as well. Like, was there a mentality shift for you after you signed up for the competition?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I suddenly couldn't train how I necessarily wanted to train on any given day. So high reps, that's kind of my bread and butter. I enjoy that. And I had to experiment with low repetition training. The way that I squat even is more of a weightlifting style squat. I was sending videos to Kristen, who was my coach for this meet, and hey, is my depth right? Like, I'm obviously going way under what I need to. But can I add more load to the bar if I cut it an inch higher? Right. And another inch higher, but is that too high? And so just getting used to that new range of motion. Training with knee sleeves, all these feel weird, like they bunch up behind my knees. Are they supposed to bunch up behind my knees? Little shifts like that in technique, but then also when I miss a lift because life just gets in the way, then there's that added element of okay, I have this meet that's now 8 weeks out and I'm missing this lift today. What does that mean for the next week of training and the next session of training? Do I make that up the day later, or do I just hop back into the training cycle?
I recently was coaching a young man who was training for his first powerlifting competition, and I think it's easy for people who've done it before to no longer appreciate how much there is to learn, just especially the process leading up to a competition, and then once you get there, there's so many hurdles to get over. Like I'm even thinking of like the competition day, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, but how do weigh-ins go? When do you show up? I've been to plenty of competitions before where, it says on the entry form that weigh-ins are from 8 to 9:30. And so you'll have people that show up at 9:30, not realizing, no, you get there at the beginning of the weigh-in window and you weigh in when your name is called. And how do you know stuff like that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it is unfortunately still kind of passed down from experienced competitor to less experienced competitor, but hopefully conversations like this help.
Yeah. Well, and that's we've talked about on this podcast before about the importance of coaching and, things that a template program or even an AI program don't give you. You can't have a conversation with them and say, hey, tell me what I need to know for my first meet because I'm nervous for this. And I was thinking about analogies, over to the track and field world, which I'm experienced with. And I was starting to realize like how many of those steps of going to a track meet do you not get from just reading the meet information and the schedule? If it's your first time there, unfortunately, getting into that sport early on in middle school, I had coaches walking me through that process, and every step was a learning process where, they could say, hey, okay, you need to be here at this time and this is taken care of, but next time you need to take care of it. And it was just this learning process. But when you step into your first meet as an adult, and you're inexperienced, there's no one necessarily holding your hand. So I was fortunate to be able to just, text some pretty high level competitors and ask them questions. So let's talk about some of the competition rules, because that was something I was worried about, where I was like, okay, I want to know the commands, although I didn't practice with the commands like I should have. I want to know, of course, like depth and what counts as a good lift. But could you guys speak to that? What are some commonly missed rules of competition that first-time lifters might violate?
The rack command.
Just use the command on the bench.
So on the squat as well, just kind of, you finish the lift and you get so excited and you just bring the bar back in the rack. The same thing on the bench press. It happened to me at my first competition. Just happens to so many lifters. Unless you ingrain that, you'll default to whatever your natural tendency is most of the time.
What's a good way to make sure that you don't default to that? Is it to just practice holding at the top of the bench and at the top of the squat?
Yeah. So if you can go through like competition-like scenarios in training in the weeks leading up, maybe 4 weeks out or even more, if you really want to be prepared, and have someone give you the commands while you're going through the squat and the bench press and the deadlift too, just so that you go into the competition and it's not the very first time you've experienced that. You've kind of built up a little bit of reserve so that you can redo it.
We'll even have people do that in the warm-up room. Even the experienced competitors will have people give commands on their last warm-up and things like that, just to get in the pattern.
I think we did that yesterday.
Yeah.
He hadn't practiced the commands, and so a lot of the videos were like, how is my depth? And from a weightlifting, I was like, your depth is fine. That is not a concern. So yesterday we were practicing the commands, and one of the things that actually, honestly, I didn't even think of, that the judges had kind of given you a warning, like, hey, if you do this again, was the knees. And I think it was your first or second squat where
First and second, I think.
Well, the head judge had made a comment of he wasn't going to give you the start command until your knees were locked out.
Oh, yeah.
And so you did, and then the lady came over and was like, you're doing a little bounce at the top. If you do that again, now you know. So it was like one of those things that, like little things like that you don't think about. And even I think with us sometimes too, these little changes that we have to make in order to make sure that you're within the competition guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes you don't. It's like you have to go through the process.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't think of everything ahead of time, because it's like without reading the entire rule book or even interpreting the entire rule book in light of your specific style. Like, so, I mean, I of course know that the bar can't go down and then come up and then go back down. I knew that, but I wasn't thinking like, oh, if I give this slight counter movement at the top of my squat, which a lot of people trained in weightlifting do, and that's where I learned to lift, was on a weightlifting club team. Then that technically counts as an attempt, because the bar is going down and up. I mean, not very much because I didn't have a lot on the bar, but it counts. And so I was thankful to have the graciousness of the meet director to come up and to say, just to let you know, those would have been red lights.
Well, and in my experience, meet directors generally know when they're dealing with a first-time competitor and are a little bit more lenient. I mean, of course, you don't want to count on that, and they don't have any obligation to be lenient in that way, but they want people to have a good experience most of the time. Back when I was coaching my academy team, I was coaching a whole team of people at this local competition, and we had several new lifters, and so I was attending to them and attending maybe a bit less to some of the people who had done, in fairness, they had done like maybe 1 or 2 competitions, not a lot. And I was kind of letting them take care of themselves a bit through the check-in process and weigh-ins. And I had one young man who was a lightweight in a 50-something, I forget what the weight classes were back then, but we go warm up, and we're waiting for his attempts to start. And there weren't, this is way back when there weren't like the TV monitors and stuff like that showing you the lifting order. You had to listen for your name to be called, and we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting. And I'm thinking, he's not that strong to be like at the end of his flight. What's going on? Well, it turned out he had entered his attempts in pounds instead of kilos. So his opening attempt was roughly 220%. And, and of course, right at that moment, that's when they called his name to go out there. And, I'm like, well, you can't go out there, sit down, and he's like, well, what do I do now? I was like, well, you bombed out of the meet, I guess, you can't take your attempt back down. Well, we went and talked to the meet director, and again, he had no obligation to do this, but he was like, this kid, he just didn't know any better, so we'll fix the error. And yeah, so that was nice of him to do that, and that's been my experience. More often than not, people are trying to help you out.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, I think that shows in sporting culture, the rules are there in order to facilitate competition,
yes,
facilitate play of the sports or the experience for the athletes, not to limit it, right? The rules are for the athletes, not the athletes for the rules, or however that would work out.
Yeah, they can't be there to serve themselves. And I think to your point too, it would be really difficult to read the rule book and just know, like, this counts as hitching on the deadlift, but that's okay. We're talking about gray areas of human movements trying to be described with text on a page, in most cases badly. So I would think I kind of say that that's a shortcoming of powerlifting organizations. We should be more clear about communicating that to new.
Maybe some video examples. And that's where a coach comes into play too, right? Yeah. Because they could say, well, your deadlift looks like this, and this is how you tend to hitch if you do.
Yes.
And so one person's hitching could look different than another's. And so how do you describe that with language?
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the differences with powerlifting compared to other sports is, like, so many people in the United States grow up watching a little bit of football, a little bit of soccer and basketball and stuff like that, but haven't seen a powerlifting competition at all. And so, by the time you enter, it's a fairly brand new thing, so going to watch a competition before you compete is another great way to see how all this goes, and, what the structure and flow of a day is like and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. I when I found out that I was the only other person in your weight class at this meet, I actually watched some recent competition videos of you just to know what I was know how to best
check it out. Check out the competition.
Second though.
Yeah, getting second to Bryce Lewis. I mean, that goes on the top of my accomplishments. So,
good.
Favorite part of the meet. So let's talk about the right gear, because I had a bit of gear snafus. For instance, so Garrett handed me a kit and he said, hey, this has been in my garage forever. You're going to need it for the meet. Here you go. Which was awesome. The singlet was maybe 2 sizes too big. That's fine. The knee sleeves, they were very tight, but then I found out you use smalls and mine are larges, so I can't imagine getting smalls over my calves. But one thing that threw me off was in the kit were elbow sleeves, and so I thought, oh, sweet, this is going to add like 5 kilos to my bench. And so I've been training with those. And then when I got to the gear stand where they were checking the gear, I threw down both sets, the knee sleeves and the elbow sleeves, and the guy was like, well, which ones are you going to use? I was like, oh, I have to pick one. And he said, well, no, they're only for squats. And so I said, oh, okay, well, then these ones. And I just quickly put the other ones away because I guess you can't use elbow sleeves in competition. I didn't know that. But what are some other common gear mistakes that you see people making?
Well, the big one was the belts, and there has to be approved belts. And I think we kind of ran into that issue yesterday because we weren't sure if your belt was approved or not. So fortunately, I had my SBD belt with me. We didn't have to use it, but definitely making sure that there are required, you can't wear any singlet that you want. There's a specific list of singlets that you are approved. Same thing with the equipment and knee sleeves, and knowing which ones are and are not approved are going to be important.
Yeah, so I guess just checking with your federation or whatever the meet you're lifting in,
it's different,
whatever guidance that's under. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would be another thing too, is once you decide which federation you want to compete in, knowing the standards for that federation, because they can be very different.
Other gear related?
It's unfortunate, just like Kristen said, just how variable the stuff with gear is. You don't need a lot of this stuff, especially at a first competition. You don't have to wait until you have a belt and knee sleeves and stuff like that to compete. At the bare minimum, you need a singlet and you need deadlift socks, I think are the only, and a closed-toed shoe is the only things you need. and everything else after that is optional and may improve your performance or safety or both. So, for a lot of new athletes, maybe, just you don't have to show up, decked out in A7 or SBD or whatever, or spend a ton of money. I think a lot of people feel like that's a barrier. So,
yeah.
I
would say too, like from an athlete's standpoint, this is a thing that decisions that have to be made. So make them and then let them be. That I find that sometimes it can be distracting to worry about optimizing belts and optimizing knee sleeves, and it can start to become a distraction. The core of what you're doing is still training and still practicing a specific set of skills, and they exist obviously, so you have to give it some thought, but you'll settle in on kit over time, and then you'll change your mind and settle on something else, and that's all right. That's just how things go.
So you're saying that the training is the most important and more than the kit. Is that what I'm hearing?
A likely story from the coach, right?
Trying to keep the job there.
Right.
You're being paid off by big training.
Big training. So speaking of big training, peaking for the meet. So there's a lot of different, I guess, stances on how to peak, and it probably is highly independent of the, based on the lifter and their style and their training history. But what should you be focusing on in those last few weeks leading up to the meet? What are some indicators that training is going well, that you are on track to do what you hope to do in the meet? And maybe what are some indicators that maybe training isn't going so well? You need to take extra rest or dial back a little bit more.
This won't be very mysterious to hear, but if you're setting PRs or things are moving faster than they ever have before, that's a sign that things are going well. If things are feeling heavy or feeling slow or sore or sluggish, that's usually a sign things aren't going well. Most tapers for competitions follow a basic trajectory and then depart from that depending on like individual circumstances. But you'll start doing lower and lower reps, you'll start doing heavier and heavier weights, and at some point you'll take out some of the work so that you start feeling more fresh headed into the competition.
Yeah. Things, lots of times assistance exercises and other stuff tends to get put aside or taken out of the program.
How do you feel about, so the way that my training was going was life got really busy in the last 3 weeks leading up to the competition. And part of me as a sports scientist was like, well, I'm missing my training sessions here and there, but I'm going to chalk that up to my taper and just pretend like it was a planned exponential taper where I drop a lot of volume very quickly. And it actually felt pretty good. I started feeling very fresh right away. And I did feel like it made up for some of the sleep deficits that I was having at the time. But what would you say as far as things outside of training? So my sleep wasn't going well leading into the meet. I try not to let that get into my head. But what are some things that an athlete should be focusing on, some stressors that they should focus on to make sure that they're just arriving at their meet capable of displaying all of the strength that they've accrued? So in that last week leading up to the meet, what are some things outside of training that we should be focusing on? So I know in my own training, I wasn't getting great sleep, but with the taper and the volume reduction, it felt like it was maybe a fair trade-off, and I was feeling okay. But as far as mentality goes, nutrition, sleep, how can we maximize what we can display on the platform through these other life stressors, managing those things?
Yeah, I think most people understand that they want to get good sleep and reduce outside stressors so that they can maximize training adaptations. But sometimes that can be a barrier too, I've definitely talked to people, a friend of mine actually, who, works a blue collar shift job, and his sleep is not great, and he kind of gets annoyed when we coaches talk too much about gotta get your sleep, because he's like, what am I supposed to do? You can't let it, you do as well as you can, and that's as good as you can do, and you keep moving from there. And if you can get, full nights of sleep, then you should, of course. But if you can't, then like I have young kids, that's disruptive to my sleep. And I don't know, I'm going to keep on training and keep on expecting good things is another thing.
Yeah, I feel like the expectation is huge. I remember I had a teammate in college where he went through this period of time where usually he was getting 9 hours of sleep. And then he came to practice one day and he was just dragging in the workout. I'm like, his name was Jake, and sorry, Jake, to call you out. And I was like, Jake, what's the matter? Like, you're supposed to be leading this workout. I was like, oh, dude, I got like 7 hours of sleep last night. I'm just wrecked. And I was like, right, that's like good for me if I get 7. And I think, but he tended to get in his own head. And I think expectations are huge. And there's a lot of research even about the the anabolic effect of expectations of training on the training outcomes.
You kind of talked about that briefly, or both of you actually, how the meet back in March where you were didn't have these super high expectations, and you were just kind of just getting back into it, and it was fun because you're lifting with your friends, and because you had done so well that your expectations this meet coming into it were a little bit higher, and now you want to, now you're ready and you're gonna do great, and how that kind of potentially had an impact on.
That's really important, actually. Like for your first competition, do not expect to hit your best gym numbers at the competition. That's just not how any of this works. You should come in with pretty open expectations, I think. Plan to have a good time and do as well as you can do, and you're establishing a new thing. And then next time you can worry about trying to improve on that performance or something along those lines. But you set yourself up for a much better time.
Yeah, I like the meet director, Rod, is that his name? Yeah, he talked before the meet and said basically that, like, don't come here expecting to hit your gym numbers. And to me, that was like, yeah, you're right. Like, because this is competition. It's so much different than where you're used to training. I feel like I was fortunate for me because I did hit better than my best gym numbers, at least lately. And I think the competition and having all the support was key to that. But I'd love to know from each of you, what's your mindset focused on when it comes to meet day? So we've done all the training and the prep and the peaking, and now you get there on meet day, and everything you did is in the past, and it's you. It's what can you do on that day? So what are you focused on?
Well, I think everyone has a different mindset. Some people like to be slapped in the face. Other people are calm and collected. It runs the gamut. I love my music and kind of just like feeding off of good energy. I put a lot of expectations on myself. My brain is a hurricane the day of competition, so I haven't mastered this at all. But yeah, my advice would be don't try anything new. If you don't use ammonia in training, don't just pull out the ammonia bottle in competition. Find out what works best for you in training. It's likely not too far from that in competition. And like was already said by Kristen, set the bar a little bit lower, and I think you may ultimately find that you have a little bit more peace on the day, and you can perform a little bit better.
I think one of the things that are underestimated, especially like in the beginning, when I first started competing, my first nationals was in 2014, and I didn't have a handler. I didn't even know what a handler was, and kind of same thing now is I'm still a basket pace the day of a meet. So having someone there who can be calm and collected and kind of take my focus is on competing and doing well. So I don't want to think about my warm-ups and what time I have to warm up and like all these other variables that can go into it on meet day. Having someone there to kind of guide you through it has been super helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
Mike, how about you?
I think you guys pretty much summed it up. I would agree that, things are pretty widely varied, based on personality a lot. So you kind of got to find, where does your personality fit into this equation?
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for your expertise. Thank you also, all three of you. I feel like, despite the hurricane in your mind on your meet day, you were even, as I was warming up and getting my rack heights, you're like, oh, Jacob, jump in here, get your rack heights. I feel like as coaches, you all almost default to coaching mode. And there's those younger lifters walking up to you in between your warm-ups and chatting your ear off, but it was fun to watch you just sort of give freely of your own wisdom, even as you're preparing to compete. And then Kristen, of course, thanks for, all of your coaching expertise on meet day. So yeah, thank you all for being here on the podcast. Bryce, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
Yeah, we're looking forward to doing it again soon.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yes, great.
Thanks.
Greatness lives inside all of us. Evolve AI uses evidence-based research and innovative artificial intelligence to optimize your workouts so you can get results faster. Evolve AI. Unlock your potential.